Good morning. We are in Romans chapter 9. And within our study itself, we're going to pick up in about verse 19 here in just a few moments. I mentioned to you Wednesday night that I in my own personal study, particularly as it related to this study of the book of Romans, that I wondered if a more, I don't even know how to describe it to you, but to look at a bigger picture approach might be the better approach to this study. I felt like that every time I tried to study the chapters in segments or in breaking it down into the verses or even sentences, that maybe the meaning was being lost because Paul wasn't trying to just make a singular statement. He's trying to paint a picture for them. He's trying to encourage those in Rome that it's okay to disconnect themselves from the authority of the Old Testament. It's okay for them to be believers in Jesus. There's greater promises and a greater covenant established within Jesus Christ. It's okay. You're not trying to make the Old Testament look bad. You're not trying to make it look like it's some kind of inferior document that had no real vital purpose. It just brought us to a point where Jesus now needs to become the emphasis. And I think sometimes if we lose what Paul's trying to teach them by overanalyzing, if you will, or overextending the practical side of some of his statements, then we miss the meaning and the thought that he's actually trying to present. And so with that, I mentioned to you on Wednesday, and I shared this with you then as well, I'm trying to take maybe a little more of a broad look, if you will, or at least taking segments rather than just a verse here and a verse there. And so that's the way we've been approaching particularly this chapter. And I'll share with you again how this chapter, I believe, in simplistic terms, break down. In verses 1 through 5, we saw Paul's love for his heritage. It may sound like, if you just read up to chapter 9, that Paul doesn't like the Jews in the Old Testament. It may sound like that Paul has some kind of axe to grind about it. And so he wants them to know here in the opening of this chapter, that's not true. I love my brethren. I would give up my own salvation. If I could hand it to them, I would. That's how much I love them. In verses 6 through 13, he talked about who really is a child of God. It's the one who puts their faith and their confidence in Jehovah that really constitutes a child of God. Not just what blood is pumping through your veins or what familial connection you have. It's more to it than that. How are you connected to the Creator? In verses 14 through 18, which is kind of where we finished, is it unrighteous for our Creator to determine any means He desires to bring mercy? The answer to that is no. He told Moses that, right? And that's what Paul does. He points him back to Moses and says this principle has been around for a long, long time. That it's within the rights and purposes of God to determine any path or any method or any means by which He desires to show mercy. And he illustrated that by showing this contrast between between Moses and Pharaoh, and how some received mercy by the very same set of circumstances, and some hardened themselves to God, Pharaoh, out of the very same set of circumstances. You think about that. Sometimes we forget that aspect. We think about the 10 plagues, and we think about them being beneficial to one segment and difficult for another segment. But it's the same set of circumstances, right? The same circumstances that God designed and purposed within the plagues could have had any kind of result that men would have chosen to allow it to have. But it hardened Pharaoh, and it liberated God's people. So he talked a little bit about that. So now as we move forward in verses 19 through 25, what we're going to see is basically a question and answer. So Paul gives this thought about how God gives mercy to whom and any means He chooses. And so he sees some natural questions coming from the conversation that he's had. And so he begins to walk a path for several verses and kind of posing those questions and answering them. In verse 26, then, he makes the transition of emphasizing the fact that the Gentile world's going to be grafted in. In a couple of verses, he'll spend some time talking about how God's intent and purposes have always been fulfilled within the remnant. And then he closes out the chapter by talking again about how faith is the key to that. So as we study this morning, we're going to look at the broader context of each of these, rather than just reading a verse, talking about a verse, reading a verse, talking about a verse. For those who weren't here Wednesday, I'm going to read to you all of verses 19 through 25, and then let's talk about what Paul said in those verses. He said, "Thou wilt say then unto me," after all this conversation about mercy to whom he chooses mercy, "Why doth he yet find fault? For who hath resisted his will? Nay, but, O man, who art thou that repliest unto God, or against God? Shall the thing formed say to him that formed it, Why hast thou made me thus? Hath not the potter power over the clay of the same lump, to make one vessel unto honor and another unto dishonor? What if God, willing to show his wrath and to make his power known, endured with much long suffering the vessels of wrath fitted to destruction, and that he might make known the riches of his glory on the vessels of mercy, which he had afore prepared unto glory? Even us, whom he hath called, not of the Jews only, but also of the Gentiles. As he saith also in Ose," or give me something else. I don't have another translation. Say it again. Okay. Some say Hosea. I'm just trying to ask you what your translations have. Hosea. Okay. Just wanted to clarify that, because depending on your translation, it may look a little odd. But in Hosea, "I will call them my people, which were not my people, and her beloved, which was not beloved." And so here he goes through this. Their natural question in verse 19 might be what? Then how can he find fault with anybody? If he's got all this control and power, if he's the one who gets to decide who gets mercy and who doesn't, and who gets hardened and who doesn't, then how is it right for him to find fault with anyone? And for who what? Who resisteth? Who has greater power than God? So Paul fears that their conclusion from his teaching would be that God has determined individually who will receive mercy and who will not. And he's forcing them to that conclusion. And so maybe that would cause me to think, well then, why bother? Why do anything? I'm not stronger than God, and if he's already decided who it is that gets mercy and who doesn't, then none of us could resist that. And so why even bother? And what I believe Paul does then in the next several verses, well, what's his response to his own question in verse 20? What's the first word? No, nay. No, don't walk that path. That's not what I'm saying. That's not the impression I'm trying to get for you to think. And what secondarily does he also say then? Or how does he qualify that no? Yeah, who are we that repliest, or who are we that challenges the method in which God would determine to show mercy to whom he will show mercy, and hardeneth who he hardeneth? Who are we to challenge God in the means by which? And remember, go back to the analogy that he used. The situation with Moses and Pharaoh was the same for both. Everybody was in the same set of circumstances. For those who were believers in God, it liberated them. And they left Egypt. By the way, if you recall, and it caused some trouble later on, but was it only Jews who left Egypt? No. There was some influence, and not necessarily a positive influence at some moments in the history. But there were others who witnessed what had happened and decided, maybe that's what I should do. Maybe I should leave Egypt as well. And my point is simply this. That set of circumstances could have created different results. The circumstances weren't any different. But it could create different results for different people depending on how you react to that. Don't question God simply because different people react to the same set of opportunities in the same set of circumstances in different ways. It's been happening since the days of Moses, and it has continued to happen for a long, long time. The very same message that brings salvation unto those who are believers in Jesus Christ is the exact same message that also brings condemnation to those who reject it. And that's really the push that he's leading towards here. Same message, but it has different results. And he's going to talk about that from a vessel standpoint and a potter standpoint here in just a moment. So, shall the thing formed say to him that formed it, why did you make me this way? And so he uses this analogy. The potter takes a lump of clay, and he may make one vessel onto honor. And he may take out of that same lump of clay and make another vessel that is not as honorable. The potter has right to create circumstances that may have varying results among those who are affected by it. And to me, it just goes to show that God has always wanted folks to be willing to be molded and shaped by the things that He purposes for them. And He uses this picture of a potter to kind of help give us of course, it doesn't register with us in the same way it would have registered with them. Very few of us have ever had our hands in clay and went around to make pottery. Some of you have. But you and I have to appreciate that it's within God's right to create His earth and His creation in such a way where people have to make choices. And some choose to be a vessel of dishonor, and some choose to be a vessel of honor. They came from the same clay. They came from the same creative mold. They came from the same image of God just like everybody else did. But the same set of circumstances and options and choices were presented to them, and some choose dishonor over honor. But you can't blame who? I really think that's what Paul's saying. Don't blame the potter, right? Don't blame the potter. Don't question the Creator because the vessel chooses a different path than what God would have wanted. And within the illustration, it can happen. Vessels of honor and dishonor can come from the same lump of clay. I'll pause. Thoughts? Okay. So sometimes he said that God is patient with the evil ones to allow, in some senses, for a significant level of difficulty to arise, where then He brings what? Judgment against them. Notice, what if God, willing to show His wrath and to make His power known, endured with much long suffering the vessels of wrath fitted to destruction? Sometimes God may choose to allow for evil to have its reign for a period of time. But ultimately, He can bring judgment against that as well. The Pharaoh didn't become who he was when Moses arrived overnight. He arrived there over a long period of time, but judgment finally comes. And sometimes God says that reign of evil can be used then to demonstrate how much mercy God is willing to extend. Sometimes His patience is to allow for a greater act to occur at a later time. Let's illustrate that. When Jesus found out that His good friend Lazarus was sick, what did Jesus do? Right. He could have rushed to the scene and healed a dying man. But to allow for a greater, more powerful example of who Jesus was, He allows His friend to die, allows enough time for that to happen, then goes on the scene and tells them to roll away the stone and brings him back to life. Sometimes God allows for time to continue. And yes, that may at times even mean that certain things that don't seem right and honorable are allowed to continue longer than in our minds they should. But He can bring down judgment when He chooses. And He can extend mercy when He chooses. I think that's a level of thought that Paul was trying to share here as well. We don't always know when the right moment is. No, I won't ask for a share of hands. I'm just going to assume it's true of every parent. All of us have had moments where we brought condemnation when mercy should have been extended, and we have brought mercy when condemnation should have been extended, right? We're frail and human and have failures. Not God. Paul says, don't question how God is extending mercy or allowing vessels of dishonor to continue for a period of time, or He hasn't addressed evil yet in the timely manner we think He should, or maybe He overextended mercy. You can't believe He's going to let these Gentiles in. Don't question. Don't question God. He's perfect at knowing the exact moment when condemnation and judgment should be brought and the exact moment when mercy should be extended. So don't question God's methodology. Don't question the manner in which God does that. We're the frail ones. We do it wrong and have. And have. Not Jehovah. He gets it right all the time. Go ahead, Jim.
We forget to think when Jesus said all things are possible with God.
Yeah. And whatever He chooses to fulfill, He can fulfill in whatever manner He chooses. Yeah.
Man has a problem with these verses. They don't want to give up what they think their power is. They don't want to humble themselves to God.
Yeah. And we make that mistake where we rather than showing humility to God's purposes and plans, we challenge it, which we'll always lose in that debate.
The vessel that was created to destruction. Is this referring to the Jewish nation?
You know, and again, Bob, I'm not saying I'm right, and I realize I'm taking maybe simplistic approaches to these narratives, but I don't know that he had that much detail in mind. I believe he's simply trying to show a picture. Sure, they fit the description. They are part of those vessels who maybe are fit for dishonor because of their choices. That narrative fits, or that analogy fits. I feel like he's talking more about those who would call God into judgment for allowing, because his next phrase in verse 24 is about whom He, even us, whom He also called not of the Jews only, but also of the Gentiles. My feeling is he's probably trying to get the Jews who look at the Gentile world as vessels of dishonor. They're the dishonorable ones. We're the honorable ones. My feeling is that he's leading them to that conclusion. That God made out of the same lump of clay vessels that you may look at, some are honorable and some are dishonorable. But I can show mercy to whomever I show mercy to, even those who you may think are dishonorable. That's what I'm seeing. Again, I'm just telling you what I'm seeing in the text. But it could be that the dishonorable ones here are the ones who don't choose the purposes and plans that God had set before them. And they're just as much part of God's creative process as well. Go ahead, Brian.
There is one other instance of Jeremiah 18, verses 1 through 10. He's addressing Israel.
Yeah.
About the potter and clay.
Yeah.
But again, here it is a transitional thought.
Yeah. Yeah, it seems to be. Yeah. Yeah, and he has done that, and I think that's that's what I mean by, I think your conclusion's right, in that there have been descriptions that show Israel in that light. I just felt like this one was more about this Jew-Gentile conversation. Go ahead, Kevin.
I appreciate the fact that you're trying to do it in blocks instead of verse by verse. If you keep this also in context of chapters 9, 10, and 11 as all one big block,
yeah,
then you see even a bigger picture of the Jew-Gentile contract.
Yeah. I aside from coming together and going Romans 1:1, let's go and read it through. It's in this, for some reason in particular, this letter mean, there are others that all of them really should be viewed that way. But this one in particular, the more I studied it, the more I realized that you really almost have to see it all to get a clear picture of what Paul's trying to present within it. And I think you're right. That's the transition we're heading to within the next several chapters. That he's been alluding to it a lot and trying to, if you will, soften the Jewish audience to be ready, because I'm coming with a full-on conversation about how the Gentiles have been grafted in. And we're probably at that moment now of transition.
The Jews would have had a problem in that verse 24, wouldn't they? Because Paul constantly,
Yeah.
the whole time, has been talking about bringing them Gentiles in.
Yeah.
Some of them, I know some of the Jews would fought it.
Right. But but then let's add the last thought within that paragraph. He said, but your prophet what? Yeah, prophet Hosea, I've been telling you about this. The prophet told you about this. The prophets told you that there was going to come a time when I will call them my people, which were not my people, and her beloved, which was not my beloved. You have been educated for a long period of time to know a point in time that was coming where people who were not once considered belonging to God are going to be considered belonging to God. We're coming to a point where those who were not considered the beloved of God are now going to be considered the beloved of God. And they shouldn't challenge that, judge that, question that. Don't rile against God because of it, because you've been told for a long time by the prophets that this was the exact purpose and plan, that God would show mercy to whom He shows mercy. And if that means the Gentiles, that means the Gentiles. And I think that's what He's been pushing for and get them to understand all along. Because, now think about it, trust me, I don't want to get into Romans 14 until I have to get into Romans 14. But I want you to appreciate that part of what Paul's writing this letter for is there is obvious conflict and challenge in Rome between the Jewish Christians and the Gentile Christians. What can we do and what can't we do? And he's getting there within the letter. But he's got to convince the Jewish audience first that the Gentiles even belong. Before he can ever have a conversation of how they should get along, he's got to convince Jewish Christians that they're allowed to belong to begin with. And that's the first position that he's trying to establish here.
Ryan, could the verse where it says the potter can make a vessel to honor out of the same lump of clay and one to dishonor, could people take that as predestined?
Well, and we had a little bit of that conversation before, and I think yes, I think that's a mistake that sometimes can come from that, where we're trying to extract a specific from an analogy. We're trying to extract specific thought. I'm predestined to be honor, or I'm predestined to be dishonor. When it's the analogy. It's not the specific that Paul's talking about. It's not the point that he's trying to make. It's the illustration. And so we have to be careful, and that's what I've been addressing within just a study standpoint of this book. Be careful that we don't take an analogy, an illustration, and try to make it the definition of what Paul's talking about. It's just the picture. And ultimately what he's really driving at is even those that you might consider dishonorable can still have mercy, because God sends mercy to whom He will show mercy. And that to me, but you're right, that folks can overextend the illustration and lose the point that's actually being discussed.
If God was designing these vessels for destruction as a predestination, why did He show such long suffering to these vessels?
Yeah.
Particularly in the wilderness.
Yeah. And I think that, well, and there's and in this, I have to be. I don't ever want to sound flippant or dismissive, because I understand people have real questions about things they see in Scripture, and I want to respect that. But let's be fair though here. If these contexts were really about God chooses specific people and rejects specific people, and that's it, the Bible really ought to be a one-verse book. It is an entire act of emptiness. If all of this effort and work went to have 40 different men compile a message that comes from the heart of God, but really at the end of the day, nothing between Genesis 1 and the end of Revelation really means anything, because your predetermined fate is already sealed. That to me is the answer to that question. You wouldn't have the Scriptures in the manner you do if that really was the conclusion that should be made from these. So that's why we try to encourage people to look beyond trying to assign these kinds of conclusions of these and see them in the context in which they're said to gain an understanding from.
I get the idea that he's trying to convince the Jews that you don't have a right to question God's righteousness.
Yeah.
You can't say that he was unrighteous because of what he did.
Yeah.
Because God is the creator.
Yeah. Yeah. Go ahead, Brian.
Go along with what you said. A good example of someone taking this out of context in this little snippet was John Calvin.
Yeah.
He used these verses to defend his predestination. What he did was he said, okay, well, this is the same thing as 1 Philippians 2:13, where it's God which worketh in you both to will and to do of his good pleasure. Yeah. And he used that for his argument.
Yeah.
And it's totally out of it.
Yeah. It doesn't fit the whole. And that's any conclusion that I draw from Scripture that doesn't fit the whole of what Scripture is teaching, then my detail was probably wrong. And I need to go back and reevaluate some specific detail that I've concluded about when it doesn't fit the whole of what God said. Go ahead, Jim.
And we sometimes in the church act like the Jews against people. I don't know.
Good question, Jim. And I think it's true. I think that we do have to be careful. I heard a preacher in a pulpit one time say that he feared that if and of course he said it tongue in cheek, but he said he feared that a lot of people will be shocked to realize that heaven isn't made up of white middle class America. And I thought, wow, I would never. Well, I just said it, didn't I? But I'm quoting a man. I didn't say it. I'm quoting a man. My first thought was, wow, I would never say that. But then my second thought was, wow, he's right. We have this image of what we think, and we kind of create these images, and it's a mistake, Jim. You're right. That God's people are made up of vast diversities from cultures all over the globe for centuries, and we have to be careful that we haven't predetermined who it is that we want in the club, and just send the message of the gospel out, and whosoever will may come, because that's the message. That's the message. Go ahead, Mary.
I apparently missed this Wednesday, but I was hoping we started verse 18. We talked here today about all the mercy.
Mm-hmm.
God can show mercy on who He wants. At the end of verse 18, it talks about who He will harden. Do we not harden our own hearts? Am I misunderstanding?
Well, and we did talk about that a little bit on Wednesday, but the point we made was that the same set of circumstances that may bring mercy to one person is the same set of circumstances and messages that may harden another man. One person sees the gospel and sees it to lead them to salvation. Another man sees the very same message of the gospel and it hardens him against God. The message didn't change. The point didn't change. And I think that's what he's meaning. To whom He will show mercy, He'll show mercy. Whatever He institutes that leads to mercy, God's right to do so. And that very same set of circumstances may lead another individual to harden himself to it. Right. And so that's how we answered that on Wednesday night. Was Yes, people make choices, but in a sense, God is involved because He presents us with options and choices. And we can either soften ourselves to them, or we can we can choose to harden, and He's involved in that from the sense of His opportunities that He presents to us. But ultimately, again, big picture, the whole thought is leading these Jews. We have to be careful again that we're not trying to pull a thought outside of the main thought of what Paul's driving at. And he's driving at trying to encourage the Jews to realize what's happening here at the end of the verse. Some find mercy, some find hardening. And if it's Jew or Gentile, I'll receive anybody and show mercy to anyone who will come to Jesus. And that's really the driving force in the thought process. It'll come to pass, he says, that in the place where it was said unto them, you are not my people, there they shall be called the children of the living God. Gentiles are welcome. He said, Isaiah, verse 27, Isaiah also crieth concerning Israel, though the number of the children of Israel be as the sand of the sea, a remnant shall be saved. Some translations probably said Isaiah, by the way. And for he will finish the work and cut it short in righteousness, because a short work will the Lord make upon the earth. And as Isaiah said before, except the Lord of Sabbath had left us a seed, we had been as Sodom and been made like unto Gomorrah. And so he emphasizes that throughout history, there have been periods of time where from the larger population, a remnant survived certain calamities. It happened throughout their history of a remnant of folks who are spared during certain circumstances that arrive. And the prophet Isaiah reminded them, even though the number of Israel might be numbered as the sand of the sea. Good luck with that, right? Who wants that assignment? Go count the sand grains of sand along the seashore, right? It's infinite. Even though the number may seem infinite in one moment, it may become a remnant that God actually spares. He will finish the work, cut it short in righteousness, because a short work will the Lord make upon the earth. He can take the larger and narrow it down. And He's done it over and over and over again. And so Paul, again, within this narrative, is trying to get particularly Jewish Christians to recognize that what God is looking for is not who belongs to a large group of identified people, but who's willing to be the remnant. Who's willing to be that smaller segment that says, I'll be a child of God by the means God provides, by faith in Jesus, by my relationship with Him. Again, Isaiah reminds them that except the Lord of Sabbath had left us a seed, we would have been destroyed just like Sodom and Gomorrah. How many times, you think about it, was God so frustrated with Israel that He was on the verge of what? I'm done. I'm done. But each time, though they were on the verge, and it even goes back, you think about it, all that effort to get them out of Egypt. And then they come to the wilderness of Paran. They're standing on the doorstep of the promised land. They send the spies in. The spies come back and offer that negative report. And what did God say to Moses? He said, I'm going to get rid of this group. And Moses, we're going to start this all over again. And Moses had to plead and beg for God to leave a remnant. And ultimately, that's what He does. That has happened throughout history. Where there have been moments where God would like, even in the days of Noah, the intent might have been done with it. I'm going to start this all over. But Noah found favor and a remnant spared. And so he says here, if the Lord of Sabbath had not left us a seed, a small remnant, we would have been gone just like Sodom and Gomorrah a long time ago. But God, throughout His relationship with Israel, had always left a remnant. And then Paul basically is saying that God's looking for the remnant. Will you be the remnant that God desires for you to be? What shall we say then? Verse 30. That the Gentiles which followed not after righteousness have attained to righteousness, even the righteousness which is of faith. But Israel, which followed after the law of righteousness, hath not attained to the law of righteousness. Wherefore? Because they sought it not by faith, but as it were by the works of the law, for they stumbled at that stumbling stone. As it is written, Behold, I lay in Zion a stumbling stone, and rock of offense, and whosoever believeth on Him shall not be ashamed. Paul admits it seems a little odd that a nation that was established for righteousness and was given a law that should have led them to righteousness are now the ones who are having to allow for this other group of folks who weren't necessarily a righteous group, who weren't necessarily anyone who were being governed by the will and law of God. It may seem upside down to you, he says to the Jews. It may not seem like it's the way things should be. But ultimately, God says, those who will seek Him by faith, not by the works of the law, those who will serve Him and find Him by faith through Christ. It became what to a lot of Jews at the end of verse 32? Stumbling block. Think about it. Okay, you're walking down the street with somebody and you're a little bit ahead. And you notice there's a spot in the sidewalk that's kind of hooved up, right? And as you approach it, you see it, and what do you say to the people around you? Be careful, right? You may stumble over this. Paul's trying to tell these Jewish Christians, be careful. I know that your temptation might be, rather than to embrace faith in Jesus that leads to salvation, to stumble because of this idea that the Gentiles are now going to be given access, just like you had access to God all these years as His people. Don't stumble over this. Be careful. Don't let God's willingness to show mercy to whom He will show mercy cause you to stumble over your need to come to Jesus by faith in the same fashion. Don't let it become a rock of offense to you. Become a believer. And those who believe on the very thing that some are stumbling over should not be ashamed. Last couple minutes. Anybody have something I missed, a thought I missed in any of these segments?
If the Jewish leaders had been honest and not wanting the glory of being a leader, they would have seen this because they would have known the scriptures that He was coming, that He was going to be humble. He wasn't going to be an earthly king as they were thinking of.
And he becomes a stumbling block because they choose to stumble. And they ignored much of the knowledge that God had imparted to them concerning what was coming.
You can use the same analogy. You're driving down the highway, there's a sign that says yield. He's yield or you're in trouble.
Yeah. I always thought that meant go really fast. We'll start in chapter 10, Lord willing, on Wednesday night. Oops, I don't want to do that. I have seen some of that about him. I don't know whether folks knew him here, but I'll certainly